Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. Early in the day, so I'll keep my voice down. As I've said before, the neighbours think I'm nuts anyway, and standing out in the middle of a load of plants, which can probably be heard from either side, talking, would appear that I'm talking to the plant. There'll be men in white coats and a van outside soon. Anyway, today's Sunday morning chat is more in the form of what I said I'd like to do is when I get questions in the comments that are maybe a bit long to answer there and might be better answered by looking at some plants rather than just talking about them in words. I've been stocking up those sort of questions and things during the week as they pop up. I mean, a lot of the questions I just deal with there and then in an answer to the comment. But like I said, if somebody leaves a comment on a video that is, you know, quite a good question, and you know, sometimes I have to go and look things up to actually give a reasonable answer, especially if it's on a plant I haven't actually got. Not many people will see the answer to that question, and it could be useful for more than just the person that asked it. So I think sort of doing them in a video makes a bit of sense. So this is more like a questions and answer video, I suppose. And I've got a set of questions from the channel Martha's Orchid window. Far too much to try and do as an answer in a comment, really. Would have been an essay. So I thought I'd have a go at that first. Varied questions, but question about mini Phalaenopsis. First of all, there's a point of order that a lot of people probably wouldn't know, but because I'm friends with a guy that deals a lot with the mass producers, the likes of Germany and the Netherlands and things like that, where these things are really mass produced in the tens of thousands for the market around the world, basically. It has come to pass that they play tricks, yeah? And especially with the Phalaenopsis market, which is huge. You know, you ask anybody that's got one orchid and the chances are it's a Phalaenopsis. Yeah, and that's where a lot of people start out. They get one and then the orchid fairies come in and they look round, they've got 50. Anyway, I've only got 4 mini Phalaenopsis and they play tricks. If they get a Phalaenopsis cross newly produced that was supposed to be spectacular and the blooms are absolutely gorgeous but a little smaller than they were expecting, the plant is not in the right proportions to go with those blooms. They'll dump growth inhibitors on the plants, which will keep them small. Yeah? Well, obviously once they come out of those controlled environments, what you bought as a mini phal suddenly starts getting bigger as the years go on. And they even do that with some of the ones that have the giant strappy leaves, just to keep them tidy and keep all the leaves more compact. Blooms are deemed more impressive the larger they are in perspective to the plant. Yeah, so do be aware that growth inhibitors are used. And they're used quite commonly with the Dendrobium nobile types. Yeah, I mean, they're normally sold when they're in full bloom, you know, and the blooms go almost from the base of the plant right up to the tops of the canes, and they look absolutely gorgeous. If you can recreate those circumstances, they may look gorgeous again next year, but chances are they won't be quite as good from that point on. They will still bloom, don't get me wrong, but a lot of those have the growth inhibitors on them to keep the canes shorter. And when doing this, it was discovered that it also actually induces more blooms. So there are tricks going on, just be aware of that, with the mass-produced orchids. Now, if you vary away from that and start getting the more, you know, the species and the more less mass-produced sort of ones that are recreated either by seeds or by divisions and things like that, you won't come across this. They'll be fine and they'll grow naturally. But I've got 4 mini Phalaenopsis, and I wouldn't say that any of them are doing really well, but for some reason out here, given how many different types of orchids I've got and the fact that a hell of a lot of them are doing really well, the Phalaenopsis don't do so well. I've never really put my finger on it. And quite honestly, I have no intentions of worrying about it either. This little one here sat doing nothing for a very long time. It did produce a spike, which I've left on because it looks like it might extend. But since then, it's actually grown another spike that looks like it's going to have maybe 1 or 2 blooms on. The mini Phalaenopsis I've always found are not as vigorous as some of their middle-sized or larger cousins that that are around, but they can be rewarding because they take up far less space. Yeah, this one has grown a few roots on recently. Hasn't produced any new ones for a while, but the ones that are there seem to have extended and in some cases branched out with new tips coming. So the roots are okay. It does have 1 new root starting at the moment. So I mean, this one's sort of okay, I suppose. The latest leaf is not as big as it should be. Yeah, but that might just be that it doesn't get watered often enough, or it's had some sort of deficiency, or it got too warm for it for 3 months long, because that's when that new leaf was produced. Chances are it's more likely to be a combination, that it was too warm for it over too long a period with much longer day length than it ought to get, combined with me not keeping up with the watering. It's probably a combination of the lot, really. Anyway, that's that one. This one, again, latest leaf, not as good as it should be. But this one's not doing too bad, and this one does have a pretty good root system. There's some active roots going on, and some new ones coming out of the base. So I mean, that one's not doing too bad, and some of the roots are making good attachment now, which is good. And this one has pushed out a few roots over this year, and is still doing it. So there's another one. These have got no IDs so far. This one is very sorry for itself. This one is not doing well at all. It's got 1 new root coming out. The roots it's got aren't bad, and there are growing tips on some of them. So it's not a root related, but there's one of them gone right round the back here that's still got a growing tip on. But nonetheless, the plant's not happy. I mean, it's got some serious issues with trying to work out what size and shape leaf it's supposed to have. I mean, we've got a short, fat one, got a longer one with a wide end, and then we've got one that was produced that, is lopsided and smaller, but now it's growing another new one. I'm not quite sure what that one's going to do. That might even stall and not get any bigger, but that one's not doing very well. This one is the only named one. This is what I call the dinosaur one. It's Zengmin brontosaurus, so it does actually have a name. And this one is prone to producing basal growths. It always has been. When I got it, it was 2 plants. Those got separated. One went off to somebody else, and this was the, quite honestly, this was the weaker of the 2 that I kept for myself. And this has got 2 old leaves that are dying back, and the other leaves aren't too bad, I would say. But look at the latest leaves. And now it's decided to push out a basal growth, which also has a stonking new root. This one has a very poor root system. It was in a pot once, and it just isn't growing very well. So I'll have to wait and see what happens with that. Now, another part of this question is, why do roots just stop growing? Well, sometimes they stop growing because they've got as big as the plant thinks they need to be. And you'll find that the root tip will just lose its green tip and stop growing. Those roots are still capable of branching if it's a branching root system. And several reasons. If you've got a recent acquisition that's been subject to growth inhibitors, well, it doesn't just affect the plant, it affects the roots too. Yeah, it affects the whole flipping plant. So that could be another possible reason. Another possible reason for roots stopping growing is that the plant's got some sort of infection, you know. That's another possibility. I mean, one of the sure signs of getting a fusarium infection in a plant is failing roots, because literally they just don't work anymore. All the pathways that the fluids are supposed to go through are bunged up, so that they just don't hydrate. Also, bear in mind that a lot of orchids renew their root system as a normal process. So older roots will die back and newer roots replace them. Yeah, a lot of the Dendrobiums work like that, especially the annually deciduous ones. They have a real annual cycle to them. So come the spring and everything, the new growths start, and as they push on, the new roots will push out, and you'll find that the older roots from the previous year just aren't as good as they used to be. They'll start going a bit brown and looking a bit shriveled. That's just a natural process, so that's not a worrying process, if you know what I mean. But again, you have to have plants long enough to see these cycles and just sort of think, well, that's what it does, rather than worry about it, if you see what I mean. Cattleyas, a lot of the older roots look a bit manky and, don't have a nice colour to them. But it's a natural progression. The best roots will be underneath the latest growths. That's just how they work. And the other thing is, when you've got very young plants, seedlings, or kikis or something like that. A kiki is a young plant by definition. How should you look after those? Well, the first thing I would say is that irrespective of whether the adult plant has any form of seasonal growth, as a young plant, remove it. Just treat it as you would like a garden plant, a shrub or something that just needs to be kept growing. So I find that they do better in slightly lower light levels than maybe the adult plant likes. It gives them a more even growth. They don't struggle to get towards the light. Yeah, so a more even thing. And under normal circumstances, I would think of what to pot them in more along the lines of seedling mix. You can buy specific seedling mixes for orchids. I just use a much smaller grade bark, the smallest grade I've got, until they get going a bit. And, once they're moving on towards adult size, I would consider where they're going to end up on a particular repot or a mount, and then consider moving them on to a mix or a mount that's more suitable for the mature plant, because that can vary quite a bit. A lot of my Dendrobiums are mounted. This is some kikis taken off of a plant. They're actually getting quite big now. I need to do something with these. They're even starting to form their bulbous parts on the canes. One of them's failing. That new growth has dropped a leaf. Now, that doesn't mean to say it will stop growing, but it might do. And another question was the transition of kikis. You can just ignore any form of transition. There's two good kikis here on this particular Dendrobium. Yeah, they've got enough open leaves to support themselves from a photosynthesis point of view, and a good enough root system to either mount or pot, depending on what you want, and what sort of plant it is. But those could be taken straight off the plant and put in a pot. But all I will say is that if you make a transition from aerial roots to potted, you might lose some. It's a dramatic change for them. So what I do as an intermediate stage is put them in a glass with the root tips in some water. And it gets those roots used to having a lot more hydration around them and humidity. So it starts to acclimatise them from being purely in the air to being accustomed to having more moisture around them. And then the next stage would be to mount them or pot them. Yeah? And these have been in here a while now. I don't have a specific time. What normally happens is they go in a glass of water, and I top it up now and again if it runs down a bit. and they'll get potted up when I get round to it. I don't sort of live off the calendar. I don't make a note and say, right, in 2 weeks these must be potted. They get potted when I get round to it. But it's a nice transition period for them to get used to having a bit more hydration around the roots before going in a media that, certainly at certain times of year might actually stay wet for quite a long time. So, while I'm up in this little bunch here, this Dendrobium, to all intents and purposes, is not growing. I mean, it really does look sorry for itself. It's got a couple of kikis that have also stopped growing, and I thought I was losing it. There's a little bit of hope. You've got 3 canes heading into the moss there. The one on the very left, which is in fact the base of the middle one and the one on the left, has a new growth. Tiny little piece of green coming out. Now, although this looks like it's got a good root system, those are not growing roots. They're older roots that potentially can still get a bit of hydration into the plant, but they're not actively growing. Now, if that new growth can just last long enough to get going and produce some roots, then the plant might make it. But, I mean, this kiki where my little finger is, it's got a couple of little roots, but the top stopped growing, so that's dead. That's probably never going to grow now. The one below it's still got some green leaves, and the one below that's dying. So this is not a happy plant by a long way, but it may make it. So I'm hanging on to it. That is Chrysocrepis. That's actually one of the big box orchids. That's been struggling since I got it, that one. So anyway, as far as potted up kikis are concerned, or mounted kikis are concerned, with young plants I tend to feed at slightly lower levels than a plant. I mean, we look at some of these Dendrobiums. I mean, pushing out a cane like that is going to take a fair bit of work for the plant, So if I can be bothered, those plants in that state of growth would probably get higher levels of feed. But most of the time, if I mix up a level of feed, everything gets it that's going to be watered that day. I don't fuss too much about levels of feed. I just don't go too high. That's the sort of golden rule. So as far as feeding kikis are concerned, I just treat them like the other orchids. When the other orchids get fed, they get fed. I mean, bearing in mind kikis are, under normal circumstances, actively growing plants. They're pushing on. But the goal with the kikis is, yes, to keep them alive, but is to get new growths from the base. Once that starts happening, you're onto a winner. It's going to make it. But you must accept sometimes you put kikis in pots or mount them and you will get some root loss. It's just the dramatic change from the environment they were used to. And obviously when they're still attached to the mother plant, they are taking some nutrients from the mother plant directly through the link. And when you break that link, that element is lost, at which point it has to be big enough and strong enough to maintain itself, photosynthesizing through the leaves and getting some nutrients in through the roots. But it is quite a dramatic change for them when they come off of the mother plant. Oh, there's another little bonus here. I thought this thing was dead, but that's growing a lovely new thing. That is, God knows, Dendrobium Jarak Firehorn Brownie. I've got a clue what that's going to look like. And I would say that's a very young plant, but it might not be. This might be the size of the pseudobulbs for this plant, and it's a division off of a large plant. But this will be the test. How big's this going to grow? That'll be the good thing. But it's growing. Again, that was out of the big box, just a couple of stumps with one leaf. Might have had 2 in those days, but just the one leaf. But it's growing on now. Took a long time, but the growth is pushing on. So, if you want to get young plants and seedlings, it's a good way of getting a larger collection, but always bear in mind they will get bigger. So don't fill up all your space with seedlings, because what are you going to do when they grow? You're going to run out of space. I mean, that's why I've downsized considerably, because a lot of the plants I've got now, I want to grow on and get bigger. Well, they need room. They need room to move and expand. So, don't clutter up your space with young plants unless you just want them for a while and you're going to pass them on to somebody else, in which case you release the space, obviously. Right, that's that lot. Some beginners' orchids. Well, in my book, there's no such thing. It's not the orchids that are difficult to grow, it's creating the environment that suits them that's difficult, and it can be quite troublesome depending on what orchids you plan on getting. I mean, I'd class a Vanda as a beginner's orchid. They don't take much looking after at all, but their environment needs to be right or they won't do that well. I mean, they need good light. Well, if you live in an apartment where you can't give them good light, they're not going to do that well, and they may never bloom. They may grow, but they may never bloom. They need the higher light. So it does pay to think about what places you've got to put some orchids in, and then get orchids that are suited to those places, rather than get the orchid and then find you haven't got those places. Try and work back to front, if you know what I mean. A lot of people just get an orchid at a show or something and bring it home and think, now where the hell am I going to put that? It's better if you can try and get your mindset round the other way and think about, right, this place here is suitable for some orchids, but what type of orchids would do best there? Go round that way. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the Oncidium types and intergenerics are good for beginners. They're easy to grow. The problem with those is getting a good one to start with. There's a lot of those are mass produced nowadays, and the way they're brought on and potted and what they're potted in, to the point where you're allowed to buy them, they're often on a downhill slope by that point. They may have some lovely blooms on them, but it's the plant. And they're often in a media that's already old, tired and starting to break down. And there's already some root loss going on, and that's the plant you bring home, So it's difficult when you're at the starting point to know what really is a good plant. But a good plant should have healthy bulbs, bright leaves, clean leaves, not all marked and manked and bashed around and dropping and going yellow, and also try and make sure there's some good roots there. Now that's often difficult because they'll often be in a pot, and some of them are potted far too deep, so you can't even see the base of the plant to see if there are roots coming out. But the failure often with orchids is the fact that you've bought a plant that's already going downhill but don't know it, and then you've effectively got a rescue plant, and that's not necessarily ideal as a beginner. Cattleya seedlings are great for beginners. You've got a job to knock them on the head. But you've got to wait. I mean, that's a young plant. It might end up being a relatively small Cattleya, and it is actually mature. But I don't know that. The telltale sign of a mature Cattleya is it will bloom. Yeah. But the latest growth on that, the bulb is bigger than all the others. And I've seen it produce all those roots. So, and that on a mount takes up hardly any space at all. Now, if it's going to grow as big as that, it's going to take some space up. So you need to try and get an idea what the overall size is going to be, and can you accommodate it. But there's no reason for not taking young plants. And if space is an issue, get some miniatures. That's Tiny Twinkle. Well, it's going to get a bit wider and spread over that mount, but that's its size. It doesn't grow any bigger than that. Those are the size of the pseudobulbs. It's a mini Oncidium, if that makes any sense. Twinkles are quite small Oncidiums, and although their blooms are not large, they make up for it with sheer weight of numbers. Their spikes can have many, many, many blooms on, and they're highly fragrant, very rewarding. Phalaenopsis, especially if you're growing in the home, they're easygoing. They're very tolerant of you getting it wrong. Yeah, they'll just put up with it. So they're You know, they're tolerant, they don't like getting too cold, but apart from that, they're not so fussed on needing this high humidity. They don't need the high light levels that some orchids do, so they're easy going. But again, you know, there are some mass-produced ones that are sold in clear pots still. But a lot of the mass producers seem to be going away from that now. Probably they found cheaper pots that are white and not clear, so they're using those. It's all to do with their costs against what profits they're going to make. But, you know, again, a Phalaenopsis with a good root system will be a reasonable buy. And apart from the problem with some of the growth inhibitors playing games with leaf sizes and things, they should do reasonably well. As I say, Cattleyas, Oncidium types. Some Dendrobiums are good for beginners. There's nothing wrong with having a nobile, providing you appreciate it's going to get to quite a tall plant. They tend to get tall rather than wide, so they need height. And the size you buy it at in full bloom, that may not be the size it's going to be. The next year, or the year after, its new growths may grow half as big again. Those inhibitors can have quite an effect and make it look like quite a nice tidy miniature plant. Brilliant for selling it, but it's a false impression. But the nobile hybrids are easy to grow. They have a good, reliable, steady growth pattern, but they will need the bright light in the winter. And for me, I believe it's the change in the light level. So if you keep them in slightly lower light during their growing season, because they don't need the high light to grow, but they do need it to bloom, and then subject them to the high light. I mean, if you're growing indoors, a nobile hybrid in the winter time in the UK can sit on a windowsill in full sun, as long as it doesn't touch the glass. Yeah? That's the brightest light you're going to get, because it'll be too damn cold in the UK to put it outside. But then again, they do like to chill down a bit in the winter. So, you know, if you can find like a cool room that faces south and keep them on the windowsill close to the glass in the winter time, you'll get the blooms. Quite honestly, if you don't do all that, you'll probably get some blooms anyway with the hybrids. You know, they're not as bad as people think. All this winter resting stuff you can almost throw out the window. They'll still grow. They'll still be okay. The Latoria type Dendrobiums, if you can get hold of them, they're easy going because they're continuous growers. So they're more like looking after a Phalaenopsis. You know, when they start looking a bit dry, they need some water, you know, and they'll carry on growing throughout the year. They're probably going to slow up in the UK wherever you keep them. But they're also not highlight orchids. You know, they're bright light orchids, but not highlight orchids. So you probably find that Latorias will grow perhaps a bit nearer the light than your Phalaenopsis, but they don't need huge amounts of light. They do like a little bit more humidity around them than some other orchids, so you might have to deal with that. But anyway, there's a few to get. Most of the Latorias are a mixture of some not complicated crosses, but there are hybrids there that have got several elements in them. There's quite a lot of primary crosses about and quite a lot of species. And with the Latoria Dendrobiums, don't be frightened of the species. They're just as easy to grow as the crosses. Yeah, they're not difficult orchids, but they are different to some of the other Dendrobiums. What I would call the annual cycle Dendrobiums that need the true winter rest, I would say are not ideal for beginners. Because you really are going to have to get your head around this winter rest thing or you won't get the blooms. You know, they are more fussy and they need it close to being right, if you know what I mean. Farther away from right it is, the less likely you're going to get the blooms. Yeah. And if you've got a cool place that hasn't got high light, you know, like a sort of, say, a northwest or northeast facing bedroom that doesn't necessarily get heated, and you can provide some humidity, you've got an almost good environment for growing Masdevallias. And they are incredibly rewarding. Most of those are not giant plants. They like to stay moist all the time, so their watering is relatively easy. If they look like they're getting a bit dry, they need some water, you know, but not soggy, not soggy, nothing like soggy, very little. But yeah, if you've got a cooler place and you can stop the old sun hitting them, although for a very short period it might not matter in the winter time anyway, they don't need high light, but they like good humidity. If you can do that, Masdevallias. You know, they sound like a specialist grower's orchid. Well, not necessarily. And some of the hybrids are even quite temperature tolerant and will actually put up with slightly warmer conditions. So, some choices anyway. Potting media types and analysis. Well, first of all, I don't use lots of potting media types, so I'm not prepared to stick my neck out on how good or bad a media type is when I haven't used it, if you see what I mean. It wouldn't be fair to those that have. So I just spotted an ant. Oh, actually I spotted two. That's -2. I mean, I tend to go for organic growing. It's how I've always grown, and although I'd be quite happy to do some experimental changes, I don't see a good reason to, if you see what I mean, because most of my plants do okay the way I grow. So, you know, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Organic media, really, you are talking about tree fern type stuff, which is quite difficult to get hold of the real thing now. There's lots of synthetic look-alike type stuff, but then that's not organic, is it? So you're really talking about bark and moss. Yeah. And bark comes in primarily 3 grades: small, medium and large. Yeah, that's a relative term, isn't it? That's small bark. Yeah, that's small bark. That's medium bark. You can see it's a little bit bigger. And then up in the, that's larger bark. Yeah, so those are the sort of sizes. There are some makes of bark that do even larger pieces than that. They tend to be a bit more expensive, but, you know. Downsides of growing with organic media is that over time it will break down and you will need to deal with that. Yeah, inorganic media, not so much. But with bark, the different types of growing styles for the orchids, you've got some that needs to stay constantly moist, the Masdevallias and the Restrepias, things down here. They, across the board, go in small bark with sphagnum moss, because that environment can stay moist for quite a long time. I mean, in the winter, these plants will probably go 9 or 10 days before they need watering again. So if you don't like work, but you see what I mean. The smaller the grade of the medium, I mean, some plants can be grown just in the sphagnum moss. And there's a couple down in there in live sphagnum moss, another alternative, yeah? But they're all organic, yeah? And the way to decide what size bark you need is have a look at the root system. If it's got great big thick strappy roots, the chances are it needs a medium with lots of space in it. So the larger bark. There's another flipping ant, that's 3 on that one. However, if it's got a finer root system, yeah, it's going to need a smaller media. The roots will often tell you, and with everything you say about orchids, there'll always be an exception. So I'll get down one of the finest root systems you'll probably ever see. That's a Tolumnia. Now you put that in a media that stays wet a long time and the roots will rot. There's always an exception. These grow out on twigs and bare branches and things, and their roots are very rarely in anything. They're on things. They grow along little twigs and things like that, and are very rarely found buried in moss or, you know, or in the ground or anything like that. So there's always an exception. And quite honestly, if you can provide the right conditions for the roots, Tolumnias are very easy orchids. They don't need high humidity, they'll live without it. Some humidity, not bone dry air, they're not desert plants. So they need some humidity, but they don't need the highest levels like some plants do. They'll put up with it. They've got thick, fleshy leaves that are tolerant of varying conditions. These need pretty good light though. But again, you know, in a window where they get a bit of sun, certainly during the winter time they'll put up with it. But in the summer sun in the UK through glass is going to burn. So you'd need like a net curtain or something in the way. But good light and a wet dry cycle. And don't keep the roots soggy or they will rot. But they're easy going, you know. Oh, right. Where am I on my list? I bet this video is about an hour long anyway. Right, I did the organic potting medias. Inorganic. You've got the leca beads, you know, the sort of little clay balls that are effectively baked clay. And as far as I know, apart from the sort that I got, they do soak in some moisture. Yeah. And then you can go on to like stones, pea gravel, the river rock, those sort of things. They're actual stones. They don't soak in water, but they can be made wet, but they're going to dry pretty quick. Yeah, so that sort of thing. And then you've got lava rock, a very rough material. I would suggest if you use lava rock, then it needs to be still in the pot and not capable of, I mean, you're going to handle your pots, aren't you? You're going to pick them up, you're going to water them, you're going to put them back, you're going to put them on the floor, you're going to move them. If that lava rock is moving around inside the pot, it's going to damage the roots. It's jagged. Put your hands on it, rub your thumb on it. This is not a smooth surface, it's a jagged surface, and if it moves around, it can damage the surface of the roots. And apart from that, it's flipping good stuff. It's full of little tiny air pockets and stuff like that, and because it's of rough and irregular shapes, there's always airspace in there, so that's pretty good stuff. Other inorganics, I've seen people growing stuff in the growing orchids in those polystyrene packing peanut things. I mean, they don't hold water, but there are certain types of those packing peanuts that if they get wet, they just disintegrate. So, you know, make sure you get the sort that can handle water. Problem with those is they weigh nothing, so your pots are going to fall over a lot. Unless you put some rocks in the bottom as well. I mean, that's another thing. If you've got a top heavy plant, you can always stick a rock in the bottom of the pot. That'll hold it still. Yeah, so I'll have missed some inorganic medias. You've also got the bare rooted thing, no media at all. You know, it makes life easy, providing you can get the roots hydrated. That way you don't have to worry about media breaking down or rotting or staying too wet, because there isn't any, you know. And some orchids will put up with that. Vandas like it, and the vandaceous types, quite a few of those will put up with no media at all. Some others will. I mean, you could class, if you grew an orchid on a mount with no moss, effectively that is inorganic. Although the bark is organic, it's not, because it's been taken off its tree and it's not alive anymore, it's dead. And certainly with the cork bark, it takes years and years before it starts to break down. So you are in effect growing bare rooted. There is no media, there's just an attachment. I mean, I've seen people growing an orchid on a house brick. You know, that's inorganic. And the roots have got something to grab hold of. And with a house brick, it even holds some moisture. The only thing I will say with inorganic media that can hold moisture, it is susceptible to storing the nutrients in there and building them up. So you need to just be aware that nutrient build-up in the media, in organic media, if it holds moisture, can be detrimental to the roots and cause some burning. So they need a good flush every now and again, good wash through. And quite honestly, a good way to the leca beads, a good way to give them a flipping good flush is to actually dunk them in some clean water and leave them there for a while. Now that way, in theory, any nutrient stored will leach out and even itself out. And if you want to do it properly, do it again. Do it twice. But yeah, inorganic media has its bonuses, because in theory the only time you need to repot is when the plant outgrows its pot. And if you take that plant out of its pot, you don't have any need to get rid of all the old media, because it's not rotting or breaking down. So you can just pot it on into a bigger pot and put some new media in the gaps. It can make life quite easy. But these are choices you need to make. Somebody's going to come back on when I said except for my lacquer beads. I don't know, when I got my bag full of lacquer beads, mine do not hold any moisture at all and don't wick. I mean, I did an experiment. I've got a glass and I put lacquer beads in the whole of the glass from the bottom to the top, and I put 2 inches of water in the bottom of the glass. And after a week, that water had not moved up those beads one little bit. In fact, the beads that were half in the water and half out, the half that was out of the water was still dry. So mine don't work. I bet nobody else has ever seen those before. God knows what they were made of, but mine don't work anyway. So somebody asked about the water temperature for your orchids. Reasonable room temperature. Not freezing cold water, otherwise you're bordering on the water with ice people, which don't do that. But ambient temperature water, if you put your hand in it and it feels like your bath water, it's too hot. And if you draw away quickly because it's so flipping cold, it's too cold. Room temperature, let your water acclimatise to the environment it's going to be used in, and it'll be fine. There are some exceptions. Deesers, I know some growers who've got quite a lot of deesers, that they get their water and their feed, if they're going to use any, because these don't need a lot, ready, and then they actually put ice cubes in it and chill it right down. Because where these grow, often in running water runoff areas on the sides of the mountains, where they grow naturally, that water's just come down from the mountain top. A couple of hours ago it was snow. Yeah? So their roots are in very cold water, and that's the environment they like. So as I said, I know some people that chill their water down for their deesers, but that's an exception, certainly not a rule. Right, water temperature. What else? There's somebody asked what my wish list is and why. Well, that's a separate video. I'm not doing that today. So I'm going to leave it at that for today. I've knocked out a few of the questions. I may not have covered them fully, but I've probably covered them a lot better than I would have done answering them in a comment. And as a consequence of this chat, I'll probably raise more questions. Oh, that's good. That's next week's video sorted. Anyway, see you next time. Enjoy your growing, enjoy your orchids, and just don't get too bogged down with it all. At the end of the day, it's our hobby. They're just plants. And every now and again, you're going to get one that just don't grow. It's not the end of the world. I mean, I've had some orchids in the past that seem to grow really well, but not the one I got. The one I got just didn't grow. There's something wrong with it, you know. You may never know why. So just because you get a failure now and again, you know, it's not the end of the world. It's a plant, you know, and living things die. I mean, classic example, the most expensive bonsai I ever bought, a type of tree I'd wanted for a long time but couldn't justify the money. And I thought, oh, blow it, I'm going to get one. I paid a lot of money for a tree. It lasted 6 months and died, and I don't know why. And that was a lot of money. That would have been 10 orchids. That was a lot of money. And I don't regret buying it, but I regret the money loss, because that was a high value item. They're living things. At the end of the day, anything that's alive can die. And some just do. And you may never know why. I mean, if you can find out why and not do it again, great. But, you know, that's the learning curve. And a comment I use very frequently, the learning never stops. The rate might slow down a bit as the years pass, but it never stops. I can listen to an orchid talk at an orchid society for 45 minutes and pick up one little snippet that I didn't know. And yet somebody else can rabbit on for 45 minutes and I'll have an overload, because I've got so much new information that I want to analyse and think about that I'll go home and forget some, you know. So the learning never stops. And Well, I forget who it was. Somebody put it in a comment. The more you know, the better you grow. I think there's some good sound, information there. The more you know, the better you grow. It stands to reason. Right. See you next time.